The ships appeared without warning. In an instant, the space above Jupiter was empty, filled only with the familiar darkness and silence that had existed since the beginning of time. Then, in a single breath, 200 warships surged out of faster-than-light space, filling the void with metal, fire, and a cold, dead light. Each vessel was immense. The smallest in the fleet was 3 times the size of the largest aircraft carrier ever built on Earth. The largest were so vast they resembled not ships, but small moons, gray, brutal, covered in turret arrays and sensor banks, with the dull glow of energy cannons charging in their ports. They moved in perfect formation, slow and unhurried. It was the movement of a power that had never needed to rush, that had never had a reason to fear anything. On the bridge of the flagship, a vessel named Zorvek's Eternal Fist, the Grand Admiral stood at the observation port, looking at the small blue planet in the distance. He had done this many times before. He had stood at such windows, over such worlds, and watched what would happen next. He had seen species fall to their knees. He had seen them plead. He had seen them try to fight, and he had seen them burn. By nature, he was not a cruel creature. He was simply a professional. For the last 60 years, his profession had been delivering the same message to the same type of people, again and again. You are not strong enough. Surrender now, or there will be nothing left of you. He turned away from the window and walked to his command chair. Officers moved around him in an oath of silence, extracting data on the planet below, conducting scans, and building a tactical picture of what they were dealing with. He already knew what they would find. He had read the intelligence reports on the way here. He knew this species. He knew what they were. They called themselves humans. They lived on a single world, a solitary planet in a small, unremarkable star system on the edge of a quiet spiral arm of the galaxy. They had not yet mastered reliable faster-than-light travel, though their scientists were close. They had no colonies on other planets, no military presence beyond their own solar system, and no real unified government, just a collection of nations, councils, and committees that constantly argued with one another. They had fought each other for most of their history. They were emotional, chaotic, short-lived creatures who lived, on average, less than 100 years. In the grand scale of the Zorvek Galactic Empire, which had existed for 12,000 years, ruled 400 star systems, and commanded fleets so large that entire civilizations looked at them and simply surrendered. Humans were nothing a footnote in the margins, a species that had not yet realized the galaxy was not waiting for them. The Imperial Science Division classified them as a pre-emergent species. That was the official term for a civilization just beginning to reach for the stars. It meant they posed no threat. It meant they had no real military power. It meant this mission should take at most a few days. Vilkos had been allotted 200 ships. It was more than he needed. But the Emperor liked to make an impression. "Begin the transmission," he said. One of his officers, a young woman named Ashari, who was in charge of communications, nodded and activated the long-range transmitter. The signal went out on every frequency that human technology could detect. It reached every satellite in orbit, every radio telescope on Earth, and every communication system on the planet below. Within minutes, it was broadcasting on every screen and speaker on Earth. The message had been translated by the Empire's Universal Translation software, which had spent the last 14 months quietly studying human languages. There were many humans had hundreds, but the software had narrowed the choice down to the most common ones and prepared a version of the message in each. The message was simple. It was always simple. There was no point in complicating it. Citizens of Earth, you are in contact with the Zorvek Galactic Empire. You have been observed developing technologies that will soon allow you to travel beyond your star system. Before you do so, you must understand your place in this galaxy. The Empire rules all civilized space. All species wishing to exist in this space must submit to imperial authority, pay imperial tribute, and bear imperial service. You have 30 days to formally surrender your world and your people to the Empire. If you submit, your lives will be spared and you will be integrated into the imperial order. If you do not submit, your world will be destroyed. This message is not a negotiation, it is a courtesy. The transmission ended. Vilkos leaned back in his command chair and waited. This was always the part that took some time. The species below would panic, they would argue. They would look at his fleet, run the calculations, and realize they had no choice. Most surrendered within 2 or 3 days. Some held out until the deadline. Occasionally, one of the more stubborn ones tried to resist, and it was always short, always painful, and always ended the same way. He expected this would be no different. The United Earth Defense Council gathered 6 hours after the broadcast. They met underground, deep beneath the city of Geneva, in a bunker built precisely for this kind of situation, though most of the people who built it had hoped it would never be used. The room was large and circular, with a long table in the center and screens covering all the walls. Around the table sat the most influential people on Earth: military commanders, heads of state, intelligence directors, scientists, and representatives of every major nation. They had all heard the message. They had all seen the ships through their telescopes and sensors. The numbers were undisputed. 200 warships, each larger than anything Earth had ever built, were in their solar system with weapons capable of cracking the planet's surface. The room was very quiet when Secretary General Amara Oa entered. She was a tall woman, calm with the stillness of one who had been preparing for something for a long time. She had been Secretary General for 6 years. Before that, she had spent 30 years in the Earth space program, not as a scientist, but as a director of strategic planning. She had spent those 30 years thinking about first contact, not the kind that brings hope, but the other one. She sat down, looked around the table, and said, "Let's hear it." For the next 2 hours, she listened. Politicians insisted on surrender. The ships were real. The threat was real. There was no point in dying for pride. Generals insisted on resistance. Humanity had a right to exist on its own terms, and surrender to slavery was not survival. Scientists argued about the technological gap, and diplomats argued about the wording of a possible response. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone was afraid. Amara listened to it all without interrupting. Then she raised her hand, and the room went quiet. "I have one question," she said. "How many ships do they think we have?" The room fell silent for a moment. Then the director of Earth's intelligence service, a compact, sharp-eyed man named General Harutami, cleared his throat. "Based on what we know about their observation methods," he said cautiously, "and the classification they gave us in their own internal files, which our people extracted from their transmission headers, they consider us a pre-emergent species. They have observed us for 14 months. During that time, they should have discovered our early experiments with FTL, our civilian space program, and our planetary defense satellites." He paused. "They almost certainly believe we have no warships at all." Another silence, longer this time. Amara nodded slowly. "Show them what happened next." It was not in any Imperial database because 14 months of observation was not enough. Not nearly enough. If Imperial scouts had observed Earth for 100 years, they might have noticed the slow and careful work that humanity had been building secretly since the mid-22nd century. But they had only watched for 14 months, and during that time, they saw what humanity wanted the world to see: a busy, chaotic, squabbling species that was just beginning to reach for the cosmos. They did not see what was on the dark side of the moon. The lunar shipyard complex, officially designated as a deep space construction facility and classified as top secret, was not one shipyard. There were 7, located on the far side of the lunar surface, hidden from Earth-based observations, and protected from long-range scanning by layers of technology that humanity had spent decades perfecting specifically for this purpose. And these 7 shipyards were not empty. When General Mi activated the live feed from the surface of the moon, the council room became very quiet. Not because anyone was surprised, most of the people in this room had the clearance to know what was there. They went quiet because seeing it on the screen, knowing that the Empire was about to see it too, made it very real. Row after row of warships in various stages of completion, sleek dark hulls, long predatory forms, weapon systems that humanity had been developing for 60 years, specifically to wage a war that no one publicly admitted they were preparing for. The feed showed one facility, one of 17 that existed throughout the solar system on the moon, in the asteroid belt, in the outer system, and in places that 14 months of Imperial reconnaissance had never even properly scanned. "Transmit it," Amara said. The live feed from the lunar shipyard was packaged and sent back to the Imperial fleet at the edge of the solar system. No words, no messages, just the feed. Let them watch. On board Zorvek's Eternal Fist, Grand Admiral Vilkos watched the transmission with a frown. This was unusual. In his experience, species in such a situation either sent a formal surrender or a desperate declaration of defiance. They did not send video recordings of construction facilities. He watched the feed closely. The ships in the shipyards were smaller than Imperial vessels, much smaller, but there were many of them. He counted quickly. His tactical officer was already running calculations. "How many ships are visible in this transmission?" Vilkos asked. "Approximately 240, Admiral. At various stages of construction, perhaps 60 to 80 are nearly complete." Vilkos studied the ships. They were well built, he admitted clean lines, redundant systems visible even from the outside. Engine configurations he didn't recognize, but he could estimate. He was not worried. 200 ships. Even 240 were nothing compared to what he had at his disposal, and these were clearly not fully combat-ready. "It is a bluff," said his deputy, Commander Zatari. "They are trying to look more dangerous than they are." "Probably," Vilkos agreed, but he noted, "We will revise our assessment if necessary." He turned back to the observation window. 30 days. The deadline remained. He was not worried, but in the corner of the flagship sensor deck, a junior officer named Pred was not thinking about the 240 ships shown in the broadcast. Pred was thinking about something else. He was young, only 12 years of service, and he had a habit of noticing things others didn't. He had been conducting passive long-range scans of the solar system since their arrival. Standard work, scanning for debris fields, gravitational anomalies, anything that might interfere with the ship's movement. Nothing exciting, except for one thing. The outer system had mass readings that didn't correspond to anything on the maps. No planets, no large asteroids. The density was wrong, the distribution was wrong, and the distance was far too regular. He ran the scan again, then once more. He looked at his results for a long time. Then he picked up his communicator and very quietly asked to speak to the Admiral's operations officer. "I think," Pred said very carefully, "that we may need to revise our assessment, significantly." The 30 days passed on Earth. They were not quiet days. Cities were tense. People looked at the sky. The news constantly covered the fleet over Jupiter. Some people wanted to fight. Some wanted to surrender. Most were simply afraid, keeping their families close and watching the feeds, hoping that someone, somewhere, knew what they were doing. But in the places that mattered, in underground command centers, in military bases, in shipyards, on the moon and in the asteroid belt, and in the dark cold of the outer system, they were not quiet either. They were busy, incredibly busy. Ships were being finished, crews assigned, weapon systems tested, and commanders were reviewing plans that had been built, refined, and updated for decades. Amara Oa spent most of those 30 days in the Geneva bunker, holding war councils, reviewing intelligence, and making decisions that she knew would change the course of human history, regardless of their outcome. She slept 4 hours a day. She ate when someone placed food in front of her. She did not allow herself to think about what would happen if they were wrong in their assessment of their strength. On the 29th day, she sent a final message to Grand Admiral Vilkos. It was short. "We will not surrender. We were not made to kneel. Whatever you bring, we will answer. Come if you are going to." Vilkos read the message in his command chair. He paused, then set it aside, turned to his tactical officer, and said, "Prepare the fleet for an offensive. We will strike at Earth orbit." He had done this before, many times. He had no doubt how it would end. But somewhere in the back of his mind, quietly and imperceptibly, like a sound heard through a wall, was the memory of Predge's scan. The mass readings in the outer system that didn't correspond to anything on the maps. Too regular a distance. He had requested an additional scan. The results were inconclusive, too much interference from the outer planets. He set it aside. He told himself it was nothing. The fleet began to move toward Earth. On the moon, Commander Yaroshin stood at the window of the ISS Unbroken and watched the Imperial fleet begin its slow advance on the distant display. She was 38 years old, with short, dark hair and the calm eyes of people who had been looking at things clearly for a long time. She had been a warship commander for 9 years. She had trained for this her entire career. Not for some hypothetical war, but for this specific war against this specific type of enemy. The space military program had known for decades that first contact was inevitable and that it was unlikely to be friendly. She had believed it. She had prepared for it, and now it had come. Behind her, her crew took their stations. Around the moon, other ships of Earth's first defense fleet were launching, conducting final checks, and taking their positions. 180 ships were ready to meet the Empire at Mars. Yara looked at the approaching fleet on the display. 200 Imperial warships. She knew what they were. She knew how they fought. She had studied them for years. She also knew something that these 200 Imperial ships did not. She knew that this was far from all that humanity had. She sat in her command chair, fastened her straps, and said quietly to her crew, All stations ready. Let's show them what we're made of. The ISS Unbroken exited lunar orbit and joined the fleet. In front of them, the Empire approached. Behind them, the real army waited. And the universe would soon learn that humanity had been very, very quiet for a very, very long time, not because it was afraid, but because it was ready. The Imperial fleet crossed the orbit of Jupiter in perfect formation, 200 warships moving in a dense, disciplined pattern that the Zorvek military machine had used for thousands of years. It was a formation based on certainty. Ships lined up in rows, weapons pointing forward, shields covering the flanks. It was a formation that very clearly said, "We do not fear anything you can do, and we are not trying to hide from you." It had worked against every species the Empire had ever fought. In Vilkos's mind, there was no reason to change it now. He sat in his command chair on Zorvek's Eternal Fist and watched the sensor displays as his fleet moved through the cold darkness between Jupiter and Mars. His officers were calm. His ships were ready. This was a punitive mission. Strike hard enough to break the humans' will, destroy a few of their cities to prove his point, and wait for the surrender that would follow within hours. He expected it would all be over by the end of the day. The first sign that something had changed was when his long-range sensors detected the human fleet gathering near Mars. "Count," he asked. 180 ships, Admiral, his sensor officer reported, moving to intercept in Mars orbit. Vilkos studied the display. 180 ships against his 200. It was brave, he admitted. Most species in such a situation wouldn't send a fleet at all, or would send a small demonstration detachment and then retreat. Humans were actually going to fight. He looked at the size readings on the sensor display. The human ships were smaller than his significantly smaller. The largest were about half the size of his mid-class warships. However, they were fast. His sensors were having a little trouble getting accurate speed readings due to some kind of interference that seemed to come from the ships themselves. He noted that. He wasn't worried. "They are outnumbered and outgunned," said Commander Zatari to his right. "It will be short." "Yes," Vilkos agreed. "But do not be careless. A cornered species is still dangerous. They may have surprises." Zatari nodded, though his expression suggested he didn't expect any surprises worth worrying about. The two fleets closed in on each other in the void between the planets. Commander Yaroshin watched the approaching Imperial fleet on the tactical display. The ISS Unbroken felt the weight of what was about to happen for a moment. 180 human ships against 200 Imperial warships. Those were not good numbers on paper. Every officer in the fleet knew that. But numbers on paper were not the whole story, and every officer in the fleet knew that too. "All ships, Yaroshin," she said on the fleet-wide comms channel. Her voice was level. She had practiced for years to keep it level. "Remember your assignments. Remember your sectors. Do not fight their battle. Fight ours." A wave of confirmations came from the other ships. She looked at the display again. The Imperial fleet was in a straight, dense formation, rows and columns perfectly organized, moving in a straight line like a fist aimed at the heart of the solar system. Beautiful in its own way, a confident display of power that had never had to adapt to anything. Yara almost felt sorry for them. Almost. "All ships," she said. "Scatter formation, now." Grand Admiral Vilkos saw it and did not understand. One moment, the human fleet was in front of him in a loose but readable defensive line. The next moment, every human ship simultaneously broke from that line, heading in different directions, not retreating. There was no pattern of retreat. They scattered like a handful of stones thrown into the air. Some rose relative to the solar system's plane. Some descended. Some accelerated sharply toward his flanks. Some curved back as if retreating, then turned sharply. Within 30 seconds, 180 ships turned into 180 separate problems, moving in 180 different directions. "What are they doing?" Zatari said. "I don't know," Vilkos admitted, which was not something he said often. "Target the nearest ships. Engage." His fleet's targeting systems began to work. They were superior systems, the best the Empire had produced in the last 500 years, designed to lock on to enemy ships and track them through standard evasive maneuvers. They had handled thousands of combat engagements without difficulty. They had never dealt with anything like this. The human ships did not evade the way the targeting systems expected. They did not follow smooth, curved, or predictable escape trajectories. They moved in a way that seemed almost random. Sudden changes in direction, unexpected accelerations, bursts of speed followed by sharp turns that should have been mechanically impossible for ships of their size. Some of them moved in what appeared to be coordinated pairs, crossing each other's paths in a way that confused the targeting computer systems regarding which ship was which. Others moved alone in spiral, unpredictable trajectories that changed every few seconds. Vilkos's guns fired. They hit some targets, but their accuracy, which usually was over 90%, dropped to a terrifying 30%, 20%. Some batteries barely reached 10%. "Increase power to targeting systems," Vilkos ordered. "Admiral," said his weapons officer with a strange note in his voice, "the interference in targeting is coming from the human ships themselves. They are emitting some kind of signal that is disrupting our lock-on systems." Vilkos absorbed this. "Overpower it." "We are trying, sir. It is not a simple jamming signal. It is multi-layered. We have never seen such a combination of frequencies." Meanwhile, the human ships were not just evading, they were attacking. They appeared at unexpected angles, never head-on, never in a way that made tactical sense by Imperial doctrine, but always from directions that exposed gaps in the Imperial formation. They fired, then turned away before his ships could react. A group of 6 human ships converged on one Imperial ship from 3 different directions, unleashed concentrated fire, and scattered before his fleet could organize a response. Another group slipped through a gap in his formation. They attacked 2 ships from inside the line and disappeared before anyone could surround them. The first Imperial ship went dark 15 minutes into the battle, then 2 more, then 3 in quick succession, when a group of human ships caught one of his rear squadrons, still trying to reorganize after the initial scatter. Vilkos looked at the damage reports. He had participated in 100 combat actions. He had never lost 3 ships in the first hour. He had never lost 3 ships in most of the campaigns he had led. "They are fighting as if they have been fighting each other their whole lives," his tactical officer said, almost to himself. She wasn't wrong. That was exactly what it looked like. Every human commander in that fleet fought as if the rules of war were something other people adhered to, as if the whole concept of a fair, organized battle was a suggestion, not a law. They attacked when they shouldn't have been close enough to attack. They retreated when they should have used the advantage. They sacrificed small groups to draw Imperial ships out of position, and then struck those ships from 3 sides while they were vulnerable. Thousands of years of humans fighting each other had birthed something the Empire never counted on. Warriors who had no fixed idea of how a battle should go, because they had faced every possible kind of battle. Already the fight had lasted 3 hours. In those 3 hours, Vilkos had lost 43 ships. Vilkos sat very quietly in his command chair and looked at that number on the display. Once, many years ago, he had participated in a campaign against a species called the Vorod, a fierce, proud civilization that had actually managed to damage several of his ships before they were broken. That campaign, the hardest in his 60-year career, had cost him only 11 ships, 43. Humans had lost 27 more than Vilkos would have liked if they were on his side. But they didn't break, they didn't retreat. They withdrew when necessary, reorganized in ways that made no sense until they did, and kept coming. Za'Tari looked pale. The other officers on the bridge were silent, but it was a silence of a different quality than before. It was not the silence of professionals doing their jobs. It was the silence of people who had seen something unexpected and were still trying to understand what it meant. "Variance," Vilkos said. "We are advancing," Za'Tari said. "But, without the same confidence, we are still outnumbered. If we concentrate our fire—" "They won't let us concentrate," the tactical officer said. "Every time we try to gather our ships in one area, they withdraw and attack somewhere else. They are deliberately keeping us spread out." Vilkos knew she was right. He had seen it. Every time he tried to organize his fleet into a concentrated combat formation, the human ships moved in a way that forced him to spread his response. They controlled the shape of the battle. A smaller, weaker fleet controlled the shape of his battle. "The pulse cannon," said Za'Tari. The bridge went quiet in a different way. The pulse cannon was installed on the heaviest ship in Vilkos's fleet, Unbroken Will, which stood in the rear of the formation. It was a weapon designed for a specific purpose, to end the battle by threatening something the enemy could not afford to lose. A planet cracker, aimed at Earth, charged and ready to fire. It would give the humans a simple choice: stop fighting or watch their world burn. The Empire had never used it against a space-capable species. It was considered excessive. The goal was always conquest, not destruction. Dead populations didn't pay tribute or provide labor. But the Empire had also never had a vanguard fleet lose 43 ships to a pre-emergent species. Vilkos pondered this for a long time, long enough for his officers to start glancing at each other. "Advance unbroken will," he said finally. "Aim at Earth. Do not fire. Give them visual contact. Let them see it and make their choice." The dreadnought began to move past the ISS Unbroken. Yara saw it on the long-range display and said one word on the fleet-wide comms channel: "Wing of destroyers, forward." She had known this moment might come. Every fleet commander knew it. The Empire had planetary guns. This had been confirmed in intelligence files from multiple sources. The possibility that they would use one in desperation had been in the war plan from the start. The Wing of Destroyers was the answer to this possibility. 30 ships, small, fast, stripped of everything non-essential to make them faster, had been waiting at the edge of the combat zone for this exact moment. Their sole task was the dreadnought, nothing more. They had trained for this specific attack for 2 years. They moved. The Imperial fleet tried to intercept them. Some of the destroyer wing's ships were shot down. 1, then 3, then 5, as Imperial fire found them. But the rest adapted, covered each other, and broke through. They didn't slow down. Their pilots understood what the dreadnought would do to Earth if they failed, and that understanding removed all instincts of self-preservation and replaced them with something purer and colder. They hit unbroken will from 7 directions simultaneously. The dreadnought was large. It was well armored. It absorbed the first wave of fire and struck back hard, destroying 4 more of the destroyer wing's ships with a single volley. But the destroyer wing had foreseen this. The second wave came while the dreadnought's weapons were still reloading from the first volley, then the third wave, then the fourth. Unbroken will broke. Its reactor reached critical mass 7 minutes after the attack of the destroyer wing began. The explosion was large enough to be seen through Earth telescopes as a new star, brief and bright, burning for only a moment before the darkness swallowed it again. 11 of the 30 ships of the destroyer wing did not survive. Yara looked at the names of the lost ships on her display for exactly 5 seconds. Then she turned away, because she couldn't afford to stay there, and very quietly said, "Thank you, unnamed humans." Vilkos watched Unbroken Will die on his display and was silent for a long time. He wasn't a commander who broke under pressure. He hadn't held his position for 120 years of Imperial military history by being one who fell apart when things went bad. He was calm, he was analytical, he was a professional, but he was honest with himself. Sitting in that chair, as he hadn't had to be for a long time, he had lost 43 ships and a dreadnought. His targeting systems were compromised. His formation had been broken, reorganized, and broken again. His fleet was spread over twice as much space as planned. His officers were rattled in a way that would affect performance in continuing operations. And the humans hadn't broken. He hadn't even come close to breaking them. "Admiral Zatari," he said, "your orders?" Vilkos looked at the tactical display for a long time. Then he said something he had never said in 60 years of military service. "Withdraw. We are retreating to the outer system." The silence on the bridge was absolute. "Admiral," Zatari began. "That is my order," Vilkos said quietly and clearly. "Execute." The Imperial fleet turned. In 60 years, in all the campaigns, in all the battles he had participated in, Vilkos had never ordered a retreat. No other Imperial fleet commander in their right mind had ever done so. The Empire didn't retreat. The Empire advanced, or the Empire accepted surrender. Those were the only 2 options the galaxy had ever offered it. Humans had just added a third. The order to retreat was given. The fleet began its long, slow, deeply humiliating turn back toward the outer system. And then, from one of the human destroyers that had approached Zorvek's Eternal Fist close enough for communication, a voice came over an open channel. It was a woman's voice, calm, clear, and unhurried. Grand Admiral Vilkos looked at his communications officer, who confirmed the authenticity of the call. He nodded, and the channel opened. "Grand Admiral," the voice said again, "you came with 200 ships. We used 180. You made us work for it. I admit, your people are disciplined and your ships well built." A brief pause. "We have 2,400 more ships. Not here, elsewhere waiting." Another pause. "Regardless, you must tell your emperor what you found here. Tell him this was not our army. Tell him that what you saw was the edge of something. Tell him that humanity is not what he thinks, and we never intended to kneel." The channel remained open for another moment. And then the voice of Yara Yarashan spoke again, not cold, not angry, but with the quiet weight of something completely certain. "This is just the beginning, Grand Admiral. The real army is coming." The channel closed. Vilkos sat in his chair for a long time after the transmission ended. His bridge crew was silent. The fleet continued its retreat. The blue dot of Earth sat in the distance, unchanging, unbroken, small, quiet, and unimaginably stubborn in the darkness. He began to draft his report to the Emperor. He didn't know how to write it. He had never written such a report before. He had to find words for things that had not happened in 12,000 years of imperial history. And he had to find them carefully, because the Emperor was not a creature who took bad news with patience. He wrote for 2 hours. He sent the report, then leaned back and stared at the stars, thinking about the mass readings in the outer system that his junior officer had noted on the first day, those that were too regular, too evenly spaced, too much like ships sitting very quietly and very calmly, waiting for an order that hadn't come yet. He thought about it for a long time. Outside the window, the stars were silent, but not, he realized now, empty. The news reached Zorvek Prime in 7 days. 7 days for the transmission from the edge of the solar system to the capital of the Zorvek Galactic Empire. 7 days for the signal carrying Vilkos's report to cross the vast distance from the small blue planet that no one took seriously to the shining ancient throne of the most powerful civilization in the known galaxy. Zorvek Prime was a beautiful world. It had been beautiful for 12,000 years, shaped and polished by the Empire's will into something that resembled not a natural planet, but a monument to power. Its cities rose in towers of pale stone and glowing metal. Its skies were constantly crossed by the movement of ships arriving and departing from every corner of the empire. Its population of 4 billion citizens lived in comfort and order, governed by laws and traditions so old that no one living remembered a time before them. The Imperial Senate building sat in the center of the capital, a structure so large it had its own weather inside, its own microclimate with filtered air and controlled lighting. It had stood for 9,000 years. Wars were decided in its chambers. Civilizations were judged in its halls. Emperors were crowned under its massive vaulted ceiling. Nothing that had ever happened inside it felt like what happened the morning the news from Earth arrived. The Senate session was already underway when the Director of Intelligence, a tall, silver-haired woman named Director Varet-Sin, took the podium and asked for silence. She got it. Something in the way she walked, too careful, too precise, the way people move when they carry something very heavy, told every senator in that chamber that what she was about to say was not routine. She stood at the podium and said without preamble, "Grand Admiral Vilkos has withdrawn the Vanguard fleet from the solar system. We have lost 43 warships and 1 dreadnought in an engagement with the human species." The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then the chamber exploded. Senators from 400 star systems spoke at once. The noise was immense. Shock, indignation, disbelief, anger. And underneath it all, that particular kind of fear that powerful people feel when something occurs that their power was supposed to prevent. Officials who until that moment had paid no attention to humanity suddenly became very interested. Historians were already being summoned, military advisors were being called, everyone was talking, and almost no one was listening. In the midst of all this, Director Sin stood at the podium and waited. She had something to say. She needed them to go quiet to say it. It took a long time for the chamber to calm down. The Emperor received the news privately before the Senate session in a room that very few in the Empire ever entered. The Sovereign Eternal had ruled the Zorvek Galactic Empire for 400 years. He was not the oldest living being in the Empire. There were species under imperial rule whose members lived for millennia. But he was one of the most powerful, and he carried 4 centuries of absolute power in the way he held himself, in the way he looked at things, in that particular quality of his silence when he chose not to speak. He read Vilkos's report 3 times. Then he placed it on the table in front of him and looked at the wall for a long time. His personal advisor, a quiet, cautious creature named Sorrel who had served him for 200 years, sat across the table and waited. 43 ships, the Emperor finally said. Yes, Eternal Sovereign. And a dreadnought? Yes, against a pre-emergent species. The Emperor's voice was very level. Not angry, not yet, just level. Like a surface becoming level before something breaks through it. A species that 14 months ago our science division classified as posing no military threat. Yes, Eternal Sovereign. The Emperor looked at the report again. He recommends a full crusade, 2,000 ships. His assessment is that the humans have more ships than the initial reconnaissance estimated, Sorrel said cautiously. Significantly more, and that their combat tactics are unlike anything in our historical records. The Emperor stood and walked to the window. Outside the window lay the capital, illuminated by the morning light of Zorvek Prime. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday and the day before that, and for every one of the 400 years he had lived to see it, the same ordered beauty, the same comfortable confidence. 2,000 ships, he said, assembled and sent within 90 days. Yes, Eternal Sovereign, it is possible. We have the reserves, and Vilkos. Sorrel paused. The Senate will demand a report, Eternal Sovereign. The Emperor nodded. That was how the Empire worked. That was how it had always worked. Victory was rewarded, and failure was punished. And this system had held the Empire together for 12,000 years. He didn't like what it sometimes required of him, but the system was the system. Schedule a public session, he said, and send the order for the Crusade fleet. I want 2,000 ships in the solar system within 90 days. He paused. We will not be humiliated by this species twice. What had happened to Vilkos happened publicly because the Empire believed that public accountability kept its commanders honest and its citizens reassured. The session was broadcast on every screen in the Empire. Every world, every station, every ship with a receiver watched as the Grand Admiral stood before the Imperial Tribunal. He didn't argue. He didn't offer excuses. He stood straight, accepted the verdict, and was stripped of his rank and assignment in front of 4 billion people. Then the Emperor spoke, and his words reached every corner of the Empire. Humans are an aberration, a temporary problem. The full might of the Empire will correct this within a single season. The galaxy will see that no species, no matter how stubborn, no matter how lucky, can resist what we will bring. The transmission ended. The citizens of the Empire were reassured. Mostly, order was maintained. Someone had been held accountable. The machine was moving again. But in the departments of the Military Science Division, in the analytical chambers of Imperial Intelligence, in the quiet rooms where people whose job it was to think about uncomfortable things worked in all these places, the reassurance did not quite reach. Analysts were provided with all the combat data from the engagement in the solar system, all the sensor readings, all the tactical logs, all the recordings from every ship in Vilkos's fleet. They were ordered to understand what had happened and to prepare the Crusade fleet's commanders for what they would face. They worked in shifts around the clock, and the more they looked at the data, the quieter they became. Human ships were smaller than Imperial vessels, yes, but they were built on a philosophy of construction that Imperial engineers couldn't immediately grasp. There was no single point of failure in the design. When an Imperial ship received critical damage to its main power system, the ship died. When a human ship received equivalent damage, secondary systems kicked in. Backup power, redirected functions, redundant control systems. Human ships, the analysts concluded, were built by humans who expected their ships to take damage and planned for it, who designed for failure as the normal state, not as an exception. More alarming were the movement data. Imperial combat tactics had been developed for thousands of years and refined in hundreds of campaigns. It was effective, proven, and almost always successful because the species the Empire fought either couldn't match Imperial technology or couldn't match Imperial numbers. Imperial tactics assumed a certain type of enemy that would try to hold the line, defend a position, and fight in an organized and predictable manner. Humans didn't fight that way. The analysts watched the battle footage again and again, trying to find a pattern. Eventually, they found one, and finding it caused several of them deep concern. There was no pattern. Each human commander made independent decisions in real time. There was a broad strategy. Break the formation. Keep the Imperial fleet spread out. Strike and retreat. Defend Earth. But within that strategy, individual captains did what worked in their specific situation, constantly changing their approach as the battle evolved. Some of them made decisions that looked like mistakes and turned out to be traps. Some of them made sacrifices deliberate, calculated sacrifices of their ships to create opportunities that other human ships exploited. Yes, they think differently in battle than we do, one analyst wrote in his report very carefully. Not better or worse, differently. They fought each other throughout their history in every kind of conflict possible, and that has produced military minds that view every engagement as a unique problem to be solved, not as a known pattern to be executed. It is difficult to predict because it cannot be predicted entirely. The report was classified above top secret and sent to the Crusade Fleet Command. Whether they truly understood it was another question. The 90 days began on Earth. They did not go unnoticed. Earth Intelligence Services, which had been quietly developing their capabilities for decades, partly through intercepting Imperial signals, partly through networks of informants among species conquered by the Empire, tracked the assembly of the Crusade fleet with grim attention. 2,000 ships, taken from 6 different sectors of the Empire, slowly but surely moved to a rally point deep in the outer regions of Imperial space, where they were to form up and then undertake the journey to the solar system. 90 days. It was simultaneously terrifyingly short and, for human military planners, just enough, because the military planners had plans that were waiting for this exact moment. Plans built over decades, constantly updated, refined by people who had spent their entire careers on one question: what will we do when the Empire sends everything? When the answer to that question was non-defensive, Secretary General Amara Oa stood in the Geneva Command Center on the 14th day after the first battle and looked at the gathered faces of Earth's high military command. "We have 76 days, she said. "Here is what we will do with them." Across the galaxy, in places long conquered and forgotten by the Empire, just as powerful things forget about small ones, messages were sent. Not through any channels the Empire monitored, not in languages its systems would mark. Humans had worked for years on this communication network. Quiet signals, buried in stellar noise, passed through relay points on asteroids and dead moons and the hulls of mining ships that moved through Imperial space, doing mundane, uninteresting work. Most of these messages were intended for 3 civilizations. The Velhari were an ancient species, older than the Empire itself, though the Empire never acknowledged it. They had been conquered 800 years ago and turned into a workforce laboring in the mines of 3 star systems for the Imperial tribute. They were quiet, patient people who had survived 8 centuries of occupation by being as harmless as necessary. The Sandre were smaller, faster, more numerous, a species of gifted engineers who had built some of the most beautiful ships in the galaxy before the Empire came and used their skills for Imperial purposes. Their shipyards now built Imperial vessels. Their people lived on rations and worked long shifts, and with careful, hidden anger, remembered who they used to be. The Kree were warriors, or they were the Kree before the Empire broke their war machine and scattered their people to 30 different work worlds to prevent them from organizing. Individual Kree still carried themselves with the dignity of fighters. Their young had never participated in a real battle, but they trained in secret, because a fire kept by very small and very careful hands can survive a long time before it is ready to burn. To all 3 of these peoples, the human message said the same thing. We are fighting. We once pushed back the Empire. We believe we can do it again, but we cannot do it alone. And we do not want to win only for ourselves. If you want to fight not for us, but for yourselves and for your freedom, we ask you. We cannot promise you victory. We can promise that we will not stop and we will not abandon you if you join us, and that if we win, there will be no empire over you, only the stars. The answers came through the hidden network, but they came. The Velhari elder who answered was named Sareth. He was 230 years old, which for his species wasn't that much. But he had survived so much Imperial rule that he knew what it meant and what it cost. He carefully composed his answer in a small room on a mining world, over which an Imperial patrol flew as he wrote, "We have waited a long time for such a message. We did not know it would come from a species we had never heard of. We did not know you existed until the Imperial fleet turned around. That alone was worth more to us than you can understand. We will come." When these engineers and shipbuilding specialists, together with their fighters, learned the weaknesses of Imperial ships, they knew them better than anyone. They had built enough of them. The Kree sent a message without words, simply a list of names. Every Kree of capable age from all 30 worlds who was willing to serve. The list was very long. Amara Oa read all 3 answers at one sitting early in the morning when the Geneva Command Center was quiet and she could think without the noise of the world pressing down on her. She read them carefully and did not allow herself to feel the full weight of what they meant. Not yet. There was still work. But she sat with them for a moment. These 3 messages from 3 peoples who had carried the burden of Imperial rule for centuries and had not broken under it. "Good," she said quietly to no one. "Now let's build something worth fighting for." Commander Yara Yarashin spent the 90 days doing something she hadn't expected. She spent them training. 20 Velhari volunteers were assigned to her ship, and 3 others in her squadron, for cross-training, learning human combat methods, learning to work alongside human crews, building trust between species that couldn't be written in a manual, but had to be earned in the daily work of a common cause. It wasn't easy. Velhari were a cautious people, precise and methodical, deeply uncomfortable with the type of improvised, instinctive decision-making that human combat required. They had been trained for 800 years to follow rules, stay in their place, never act without permission. Asking them to think for themselves in a combat situation seemed to many of them like asking them to run before they had learned to stand. There were frictions, arguments, misunderstandings, moments of frustration on both sides. Yara had to learn things about Velhari culture that she didn't know, that direct questions were considered rude, that disagreement was expressed by silence rather than words, that trust was given slowly but once given was absolute. A Velhari crew member named Teth became a point of contact. He was young, curious, and possessed a quality that Yara recognized immediately. He watched everything. He studied the human crew members the way a human studies something they have decided to understand completely. He made mistakes, and then he didn't make them again. One evening, 3 weeks in, he found her at the observation window after a shift. "Commander," he said, "may I ask something?" "Speak. Your people in the battle, those who went with the destroyer wing." He paused, choosing his words. They knew they might not return. Most of them didn't return. "Yes." Teth paused. "And they went?" "Yes." "Why?" Yara thought. Not because it was a hard question, but because she wanted to answer it well. Because the alternative, she said finally, was worse than not returning. Because some things are worth the price. Because they were human, and humans are always willing to pay that price for each other. She paused. For humans who aren't human yet, but might become family later. Teth was silent for a long time after that. He looked at the stars. "I think," he said slowly, "I am beginning to understand you." On the 68th day of 90, an Imperial reconnaissance agent on a neutral trade station in the Far Belt intercepted a fragment of a human transmission. The transmission was encrypted at a level that the agent had to work for 6 hours to crack. And even then, only a fragment passed. The fragment consisted of 11 words. "Frontier fleets are recalling to the solar system." The agent stared at the words. Frontier fleets. It was a phrase she had never encountered in any intelligence file, any known database, any intercepted human communication before. It meant nothing to her directly, but something in the phrasing, the context, the confidence in it gave her a chill on the back of her neck. She marked it as priority and sent it through the network to Imperial Intelligence to Director Sin. The director received it in her office on Zorvek Prime early in the morning. She was a methodical person, having worked in intelligence for 200 years. She didn't panic easily. In her career, she had read tens of thousands of intercepted transmissions and learned to distinguish those that mattered from those that didn't. She read the 11 words 3 times. Then she extracted all the data she had about the human space program, everything collected over 14 months of observation, plus everything extracted from Vilkos's combat logs, and she began to calculate. The calculations took her 4 hours. When she finished, she sat still for a very long time. Then she took the direct phone to the Emperor's office. She had never used the direct line before. It was intended for information that could not wait for a scheduled briefing. When the Emperor's secretary answered, the director simply said, "I need to speak to him now. Not later. Now." Her voice was controlled but restless, because the frontier fleets, whoever they were, wherever they had come from, however long they had been out there in the dark building and arming themselves, were coming home. And humanity, it turned out, had never shown the Empire its real face, not even close. The Imperial Crusade fleet arrived at the edge of the solar system on the 89th day, 2,000 warships. The largest military force ever assembled in the history of the Zorvek Galactic Empire, possibly the largest military force ever assembled in the history of the known galaxy. They emerged from faster-than-light space in a single, coordinated wave, filling the outer darkness of the solar system with the light of their engines and the cold shadow of their hulls. There were so many, and they were so large, that the combined light they blocked caused a measurable dimming of sunlight at the edge of the system. Worlds and fleets would surrender just by being told that such a force was approaching. Species would fold whatever weapons they had and open the doors of their planets before a single shot was fired. The view of the Crusade fleet was supposed to be the end of the conversation, the final, overwhelming argument that no rational being could look at and not agree with. Commanding this fleet was Supreme Warlord Senex. He was not like Vilkos. Vilkos was a cautious commander, an experienced, methodical military mind who won through preparation and patience. Senex was different. He was aggressive, direct, and deeply confident, as only someone who had never been seriously tested could be. Had he won campaigns? Yes. He broke species and conquered worlds. But he did it the way a hammer breaks a nail, with overwhelming force applied in a straight line. He had read the analysts' reports on human combat tactics. He had read Director Sin's urgent message about the frontier fleets. He considered both these points and came to the conclusion that they were the kind of cautious drivel that analysts and intelligence directors produce when they spend too much time reading reports and not enough time understanding what pure force looks like in practice. He had 2,000 ships. Humans had lost 27 inches the first engagement. They had started with 180. Even if they had recovered, even if they had finished the ships visible in the Moon shipyard transmission, they couldn't have more than 400 or 500 combat-ready vessels. He outnumbered them by at least 4 to 1. His ships were larger, his weapons were stronger, his crews were trained to imperial standards developed over 12,000 years. This was not a battle. It was a conclusion. He stood at the command window of his flagship, Absolute Will of the Emperor, and looked at the distant point of the sun at the center of the human system, feeling the particular satisfaction of a man who already knows how the story ends. All ships, advance, he said. Standard formation as we head to Earth. The human fleet waited by the asteroid belt, 600 ships scattered along the inner edge of the ring filled with rocks surrounding the sun between Mars and Jupiter. They were positioned in a wide, multi-layered pattern, not in a single line, not in a tight cluster, but in a dispersed formation that covered a vast area of space and forced any attacking fleet to deal with ships appearing from several directions simultaneously. Supreme Warlord Senox saw 600 ships on his tactical display and allowed himself a small, cold smile. 600. He had expected more. Analysts had predicted more. But 600 against 2,000, that was not a battle. That was a formality. He opened a channel to the entire human fleet, broadcasting on all frequencies. He wanted them to hear his voice. He wanted them to understand what was coming while there was still a moment to choose otherwise. "Citizens of Earth," he said. His voice carried the particular tone of a man announcing an obvious fact. "I am Supreme Warlord Senox of the Imperial Crusade Fleet. I have brought 2,000 warships into your solar system. You have 600. I have seen the footage of your first engagement. I know your tactics. I know your tricks. I know how you fight. And I have planned for all of it." He paused, looking at the dispersal of human ships on his display. "This does not have to end with the destruction of everything you are. Surrender now, and your people will live. Your world will survive. Part of what you have built will be allowed to remain. This is the last offer you will receive. Is this really all the creatures of Earth are capable of?" He waited. The answer that came was not a voice. It was a target lock. 600 human ships simultaneously locked their weapons on the forward edge of the Imperial fleet. Senox expected this. "Advance," he said. "All batteries, fire." The battle at the asteroid belt was brutal, unlike the first battle. Senox had studied human tactics, and he had prepared real countermeasures. His fleet didn't advance in the rigid, tight formation that Vilkos had used. He deliberately spread his ships out, mirroring the human dispersal, refusing to give them a tight cluster to pick apart. His targeting systems were updated with new software designed to compensate for the interference signals that the human ships emitted. His commanders were thoroughly instructed on the hit-and-run methods humans favored and had orders to pursue aggressively rather than hold position, and it partially worked. The human fleet didn't have as easy a success as in the first battle. Imperial fire was more accurate this time. Imperial ships reacted more fluidly to the swarming attacks. The battle was harder for the humans than at Mars, and they felt it in their losses in the first hour. 14 ships lost, then 20, then 30. As the massive weight of 2,000 Imperial ships began to tell, the humans fought brilliantly. Even Senox, watching the tactical display, could admit that. Their captains made decisions that his computer still struggled to predict. They used asteroids as cover, hiding behind rocks the size of small cities, then appearing from unexpected angles. They created what looked like retreats that turned into ambushes. They coordinated in a way that seemed almost instinctive, small groups of ships working together with a fluidity, suggesting they had trained together for years, which of course they had, but they were slowly being pushed back. Inevitably, the weight of numbers was driving the battle to its conclusion. The human fleet was retreating neatly, fighting for every kilometer, bleeding the Imperial advance as much as possible. But the asteroid belt was behind them. Mars was ahead, And after Mars, Earth. Senex watched his tactical display with growing satisfaction. This was how it was supposed to go. This was the correct order of things. Imperial power, correctly applied, was overcoming an obstacle that had become too large in some people's imaginations. He would reach Earth orbit in a few hours. He would target his most powerful weapon at the surface and transmit the final ultimatum. And this time, with their fleet broken and their planet in his crosshairs, the humans would kneel. He was reflecting on the exact wording of his victory message when his sensor officer made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was a barely audible sound. It was that small, involuntary sound that people make when something happens that is too big to immediately process, too far beyond the expected to cause a normal reaction. Senex raised his head. "Report," he said. The sensor officer was looking at her display. She looked up at him with an expression he had never seen before on one of his crew members. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked back at her display as if hoping it had changed. It hadn't. "FTL exits," she said. Her voice was very careful, the voice of a person delivering information that she knew would change everything, and she wasn't sure how the person receiving it would react. "Multiple FTL exits." "How many?" Senex asked. The sensor officer looked at her display again. She conducted the count twice. She conducted it a third time, because the number seemed impossible. "All vectors, sir," she said again. "They are coming from all directions. They exited from faster-than-light space in waves. Not from one direction, not from two or three, but from all directions simultaneously. Above and below the plane of the solar system, from the inner system and the outer darkness, from the side of the galactic core and from the side of open space." FTL exits blossomed on Senox's tactical display like lights turning on in a city at sunset. 1, then 10, then 50, then hundreds. The numbers were rising so fast his display system could barely keep up with counting them. These were not ships from the asteroid belt. These ships were different, larger than those he had been fighting. Still not as large as Imperial warships, but significantly larger than the 600 ships that had been bleeding and retreating for the last hour. Their hull designs were similar, but not identical variations on the human template, built in a slightly different style, as if they had come from another place with a slightly different set of tools, which, of course, they had. The frontier fleets had been in the dark for 60 years. They had been built, manned, and armed by generations of humans who had grown up not on Earth, but among the stars in the asteroid belt, on the outer planets, and eventually beyond Earth's solar system in 14 star systems. They were the secret that Secretary General Oa had mentioned in her message, the secret that Director Sin had begun to piece together too late, the secret that Vilkos's junior officer had seen in the mass readings on the first day and hadn't quite understood. There were 3,200 of them, and behind them, moving on their own FTL signatures in tight formation, came the ships of the allied species Velhari, Sandre, and Krei, ships that were smaller, less armed, manned by beings who had lived their entire lives under Imperial rule, and for the first time in their history were flying into battle with their own flags on their hulls and their own commanders at the helm. They were not as strong as the human ships. They had been free for less than 90 days, but they were there. The total count on Senox's display stopped, and the number sat there and refused to be anything other than what it was. 4,800 ships surrounding the Imperial Crusade fleet from all sides. Supreme Warlord Senex did not move for a long time. His bridge was completely silent, that type of silence that happens not because nothing is said, but because no one can find words for what they are seeing. His officers stared at their displays. Some looked at each other. One very junior sensor technician at the back of the bridge was conducting the count for the 4th time, as if the very act of recounting could yield a different result. It didn't. Senex had 2,000 ships. He was surrounded by 4,800. The 600 ships he had been fighting, the ones he had been pushing back, the ones he was sure represented the measure of human strength, stopped retreating. They turned around. Come on. They were rejoining the battle. Their hulls still bore the marks of the last 2 hours of combat. Their weapons were already retargeting. He realized several things at that moment with perfect clarity. He realized that the human fleet he had been fighting was not the real human fleet. It was a diversionary force, large enough to make the battlefield real, to keep his fleet in place and keep it focused on the battle ahead while the walls closed in from all sides. The 600 ships hadn't been fighting to win. They had been fighting to hold him in place while the 4,800 ships took positions. He realized that everything he had prepared, the updated targeting systems, the counter-tactics, The careful study of human methods was prepared against the wrong information. He had prepared to fight the species that had encountered Vilcos at Mars. He hadn't been told what was in the dark, because no one in Imperial intelligence knew. Director Sin suspected the fragment about the frontier fleets was a warning, but the full scale of it, 14 star systems, 60 years of construction, generations of humans born among the stars and trained to fight among them, was not in any file, anywhere in the Imperial database, because humanity had never shown them that. And he realized, finally and completely, something that the analysts' reports had been trying to say and which he hadn't truly heard. Humans were preparing for this war not because the Empire sent a fleet. They were preparing for this war because they had always known that one day a fleet would come. They had been building for 60 years for an enemy they had never met against a threat that hadn't materialized until 14 months ago, because they were the type of species that looked into the dark and said, "There is something there," and then prepared. He reached for his comms. His first officer, standing 2 paces to his right, said very quietly, "Warlord, what are your orders?" Senox thought about his orders. He thought about what 2,000 ships could do against 4,800. He thought about how a commander should think about a battle. He ran the calculations. He considered the angles. He looked at the tactical picture with the same cold professionalism he had always brought to every engagement. He arrived at the same conclusion every time. "Broadcast on all channels," he said finally. "The Human Communications Team." The channel opened to the ISS Unbroken. Commander Yarashin heard the channel request and accepted it. She had been waiting for this. "Commander Shen," Senex said. It was the first time he had addressed her by name. He had learned it from the intelligence files. He hadn't thought he would have to use it this way. "Supreme Warlord," Yara said. A brief pause. "You were holding back?" he said. Not an accusation. A belated statement of understanding. "Yes," she said. 600 ships. They were a trap. They were a door," she said. "We needed you to be inside the system before the rest arrived. You obliged us." Another pause. His display was still updating as the Allied ships completed the encirclement. Kree fighters had taken positions on his port flank. Sandre engineering ships hung at a distance. Velhari ships stood steady and patient in the formation the humans had taught them. "How long?" he said. "How long have you been building this?" 60 years, Yara said. "Give or take." Senex absorbed this. "Your people," he said, "knew this was coming 60 years ago. They knew that something was coming. Humans didn't know exactly what or when," Yara said. "They just knew that when it came, they wanted to be ready. That is what humans do. We prepare." He looked at his display once more. 4,800 ships. The Imperial Crusade fleet was surrounded. The largest military force in galactic history was held by something larger. "I have 2,000 ships," he said. "Shen, I will not surrender them without a fight." "I know," Yara said. "I didn't expect you to surrender." The channel closed. What followed was not a battle in the sense Senex had imagined his battles. It was not a contest between two forces with a real question about the outcome. It was a systematic dismantling, performed with the precision of people who had planned this exact moment and were executing the plan. The Imperial fleet fought. They fought hard, because they were well-trained professional warriors, and they had pride, and they had orders. And some things don't stop being true just because the situation is hopeless. Some ships broke the encirclement and escaped. They were pursued and caught by ships of the frontier fleets waiting in the outer system. Yes, some formed tight defensive clusters and fought for every centimeter of space as best they could. Some simply turned their weapons outward and fired in all directions until there was nothing left to shoot with. Senex's flagship was among the last to fall. It fought to the end, and when the end came, it came quickly. It didn't die. Absolute will of the Emperor was boarded by a strike team from the ISS Unbroken. Human soldiers in gray armor who moved through the damaged corridors of his ship with that same annoying, difficult-to-predict fluidity that his analysts had spent weeks trying to understand. They reached the bridge, captured his staff, and stood Senox against the wall of his own command room with his hands tied. He looked at the human soldier holding a weapon on him and thought about everything. About 2,000 ships lost at Mars. About 14 months of observation that missed 60 years of preparation. About the ships that had come from all directions like the closing of a fist. He thought about how the Emperor had received his report. He thought about what the galaxy would be like after this. A medic checked him for injuries. The soldier offered him water. The human leading the strike team, a young woman with a calm face and rank insignia he couldn't read, told him in his language that he was a prisoner of the Earth Defense Force and that he would be treated with respect. He sat against the wall of his captured bridge and thought, how strange. Only the Empire took prisoners, but the Empire usually didn't start interactions with prisoners by telling the prisoner he would be treated with respect. He noted that. It seemed important, though he didn't yet know why. The battle was over by the end of the day. Debris drifted through the solar system, shattered remains of Imperial ships scattered across the space between Mars and the asteroid belt, like shards of something that had been very sure of itself and turned out to be wrong. Human rescue teams were already moving through the debris, looking for survivors and escape pods, cataloging the dead, performing the long and quiet work that comes after the loud work. Allied ships held their positions, steady and confident. Velhari, Sandre, and Kree, present in the human solar system, raised their flags on their hulls for the first time in centuries or ever. Teth, standing at the window of the ISS unbroken next to the place where he had spent 90 days learning what humans were, looked at the Velhari ships and was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Are we here?" And Yara, standing next to him, said, "Yes, you are here, in the wreckage of the Imperial flagship, among the pieces of absolute will of the Emperor, still spinning slowly in the darkness." In the final minutes of the battle, an escape pod had been launched. Inside it, Supreme Warlord Senox was recording his final intelligence report over a secure channel, encrypted only for the Emperor's eyes. He recorded everything: 4,800 ships, allied species, 60 years of preparation, tactics, frontier fleets, the word about how humans had opened a door and waited for him to walk in. And in the end, because he was a professional and because he believed in providing his commanders with all necessary information, he added something else. A projection that his tactical officer had conducted in the final minutes of the battle before her station went dark. A calculation based on the ship designs he had seen, construction rates implied by the objects in the intelligence files, and the possible volume that 60 years of construction in 14 star systems could reasonably produce. The projection stated that the 4,800 ships were not humanity's full military might. They were based on everything the data suggested, approximately 60% of it. Senox recorded this number. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said in the level voice of a man who had moved past shock and into something quieter and colder, "The force that destroyed us was their reserve, eternal sovereign. The full fleet has not yet been seen. I do not know what they are waiting for. I do not know if they are waiting for anything at all." He paused. "But I believe with full certainty that we have made a very serious mistake." The pod drifted in the darkness. Its beacon pulsed steadily, carrying its message back to the Empire. Behind it, in the solar system it had come from, the lights of 4,800 ships burned against the black, steady, unbroken, and very much home. The real army had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Galactic Empire was in shock. This was just the beginning. The real army was coming. Emperor Pecan did not speak for 3 days. This was not unusual in the sense that the Sovereign Eternal was known to spend long periods of silence when reflecting deeply on something. He had ruled for 400 years, and during that time, he had learned that the most important decisions, the ones that shaped the galaxy for centuries, deserved more than a quick response. He sat in his private quarters in the tall, quiet room where light passed through windows that had stood for 9,000 years. And he read Senox's final report again and again until the words stopped being words and became something else, a form, a problem, a new reality that had to be understood before he could answer. On the 4th day, he called for his advisor, Sorrel. Sorrel came quietly, as always. He sat across the long table and waited. He had served this emperor for 200 years. He knew when to speak and when to be quiet. This was a time to be quiet. The emperor placed the report on the table between them. "How did we not know?" he said. His voice was not angry. It was something that was harder to hear than anger. It was genuine bewilderment. In 400 years, Veldar Duran had not experienced genuine bewilderment very often. How did one species on one world in a star system we were observing build all this without being noticed by us? Sorrel thought about the question carefully. He had reflected on it for 3 days on his own, preparing for this exact moment because he had learned that the Emperor asked about the things he didn't yet have answers for. "Because we were not looking for the right thing," he said. "When we surveyed a new species, we looked for technologies that would match our ships, that would look like ships, weapons that looked like weapons, military facilities that would match what we thought military facilities looked like. He paused. Humans built everything underground, on the dark side of their moon, in the asteroid belt, in the outer system in places that we did not scan thoroughly because we looked at this species and decided they were not worth thorough scanning. We decided they posed no threat, the Emperor said. Yes, because they were young, yes, and because they were chaotic. They argued with each other. They had hundreds of languages and dozens of governments. They seemed disorganized. Sorrel paused again. In many ways, they were disorganized, but under the chaos, they were building quietly, patiently, with a level of long-term planning we did not consider possible for a species of their age. The Emperor looked at the window. Outside, the capital of Zorvek Prime was very quiet. The news had now reached the public. Not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough. People knew that the Crusade fleet was gone. 2,000 ships. The largest force ever assembled, destroyed or captured by a species that 14 months ago was classified as pre-emergent and non-threatening. The streets were not empty, but they were quiet in a way they hadn't been for a very long time. The Senate wants war, the Emperor said. They are calling for full mobilization. Every reserve fleet, every sector command. Burn the human system to the ground and be done with it. Sorrel said nothing. You do not agree, the Emperor said. I think the Senate is afraid, Sorrel said cautiously. And frightened people want to do something big and final, something that will make the fear go away. But Senex's last report says that the 4,800 ships constituted only 60% of human strength. If we send everything we have, and they have something else waiting somewhere that we don't know about, he let the thought finish itself. The Emperor was silent for a long time. Then what should we do? He said. And for the first time in a very long time, the question was genuine, not rhetorical, not a test of his advisor's thinking. A real question from a being who had just discovered that the galaxy he had ruled for 4 centuries was not the galaxy he had thought it was. Sorrel reached into his robe and placed one document on the table. They sent this, he said. Secretary General Oa. It arrived this morning. The Emperor picked it up and read, It was not a declaration of war. It was not a list of demands. It was not the message the Empire sent when it was winning, the one that said, kneel and pay and serve. It was something completely different. And the Emperor read it twice because the first time, he wasn't sure he was reading it correctly. It was an invitation. Secretary General Amara Oa had written the message in the same early hours when the Geneva Command Center was quiet, and she could think without the noise of the world pressing down on her. She had spent the 3 days after the battle doing the same thing as the Emperor, sitting with what had happened, fully understanding it before saying anything about it. She walked through the command center in the quiet hours and looked at the faces of her staff and thought about what it meant to win and what it meant to do something worth winning. Then she wrote the message. It spoke in simple language that could not be misinterpreted, that humanity did not want imperial territory. It said that humanity had not fought this war to become what it was fighting against. It said that the species the Empire had conquered and enslaved during its 12,000 years of expansion deserved to be free, not because humanity said so, but because freedom was not something one civilization could take from another and call it rule. It said that Earth was ready for negotiations, ready to discuss a new order that would not require anyone to kneel, and that the only thing humanity was not ready to negotiate on was the freedom of conquered species and the end of the practice of conquest. And it said something else at the end, in the simplest language she could find. We did not ask for this war. We did not want it. We prepared for it because we understood that it was coming, and we survived because we prepared well. But we are not conquerors. We are not an empire. We are humanity. And we offer you something your civilization has never offered anyone in 12,000 years, a choice that does not end in chains. Talk to us. That is all we are asking. Talk to us, and we will listen. The Emperor read it twice. Then he folded it and placed it inside his robe and looked at Sorrel for a long time. She is either the most honest leader I have ever met, he said slowly, or the most dangerous. Perhaps both. Eternal sovereign, Sorrel said. The Emperor thought for a long time. And then, because 400 years of rule had given him, among other things, the ability to recognize a door when it opened. Send a response, he said. Tell her we are ready to talk. The negotiations took place on a neutral station, a small old object in the space between 2 star systems, chosen because it belonged to no one and, therefore, insulted no one. Amara Oa arrived with a small delegation. Imperial representatives arrived with a larger one because the Empire had never learned to travel light. They sat at a table that was neither imperial design nor human, but was simpler and older, and they began. It wasn't easy. 12,000 years of imperial habits didn't change in 1 meeting or 10 meetings or 50. There were arguments. There were moments when everything almost collapsed when an imperial senator said something that sounded like a stone thrown through glass, or when a human delegate insisted too strongly on a point that the Empire was not ready to concede. There were nights when Amara returned to her apartments on the station and sat in the dark, wondering if she was naive. Was the Empire using the negotiations to buy time while it rebuilt its fleet? Was this all a beautiful mistake? But she kept returning to the table in the morning, and slowly, like a door that had been locked for a very long time, things began to move as it first opened. The Velhari were the first to leave. The mining worlds they had worked on for 800 years were returned to them through the first of the agreements, a short document, simply phrased, which in legal terms said what everyone at the table already knew. Velhari had been taken from their home system, and they had the right to return to it. Elder Sareth was not present when the first colonial ships of the Velhari crossed back into their home system. He was old, and the journey was long, and his body was no longer what it once was. But he watched the feed from the observation room on the neutral station, where he had remained as a representative of his people during the negotiations. He watched the ships landing. He watched his people step onto the land that their great-grandparents had been taken from a world that had been theirs before the Empire arrived, where he watched them kneel and put their hands in the dirt, as people do when they touch something they thought was lost forever. He sat in a chair in the observation room and was silent for a long time. Commander Yarashin came and sat next to him. She was on the station for the negotiations, representing Earth's military command. She had no official reason to be in the observation room at that moment. She came anyway. They watched the feed together in silence. After a while, Sareth said, 800 years. Yes, Yara said. We kept the songs, he said. Songs about the home world. We sang them to our children, and they sang them to theirs. And even when the Empire forbade them, we kept them in silence. We were afraid that one day we would forget what we were singing about. Yara was silent, and there was nothing that could be said that wouldn't be less than the moment. Sareth looked at her. Your people didn't have to do this, he said. You won the war. You could have taken what you wanted and set your own rules. We could have, Yara agreed. Why didn't you? Yara thought. About the wing of destroyers and the 11 ships that didn't return. About Teth at the window saying, we are here. About Amara Oa writing a message that offered a choice instead of chains. Because we had been on the losing side before, she said finally. A long time ago in our own history, on our own world. We know what it is like when someone takes everything from you and calls it the natural order of things. We didn't want to be like that. She paused. And because the people on those ships down there are worth more than everything we could have taken. Sareth looked at the feed again. His people were still landing. There were many of them. It would take many ships and many days. I think, he said quietly, that your species will be very interesting to study. Sandre engineers returned to their shipyards and began to build again. Their own ships this time. Under their own flags, for their own purposes. The designs they produced were different from anything they had built under imperial guidance, freed from the requirement to build for imperial efficiency and imperial scale. They built things that were smaller, more elegant, and, in the opinion of a few human engineers who saw the early designs, quite beautiful. The Kree took more time. Their people were scattered across 30 worlds, and gathering them was a slow process. But they gathered. And as they gathered, they remembered who they were before the Empire came. They didn't become what they had been. You can't return to a form changed by 800 years of pressure, but they found something new that had the bones of the old. They sent a delegation to Earth. The delegation spent 6 months there, learning and teaching. And when they returned home, they brought with them a word in their language that translated approximately as ally, and placed it next to a word they hadn't used for 8 centuries, which translated approximately as free. On Zorvek Prime, the changes were slower, harder, and less clean, and the Emperor signed the Accord of Galactic Liberation on a gray day in the Senate Hall, surrounded by senators who had argued about it for months. Some of them signed it out of duty, some signed it because they looked at the numbers and realized the alternative to signing was a war they couldn't win. Some signed because 400 years of imperial confidence had cracked so much that something new could get in, and what was getting in felt uncomfortable and unexpected, like the right thing. The accord was not perfect. No document written by many different species over a wide table for many months is ever perfect. There were compromises that satisfied no one completely, and provisions that would be debated for years. But it said the most important thing. It said that conquest had ended. It said that the species the Empire had taken were free. It said that the Empire would remain not destroyed, not dissolved, but changed, limited, no longer the law of the entire galaxy, but one powerful civilization among several, obliged for the first time in its history to negotiate rather than dictate. Amara Oa signed for Earth. She used a simple pen, the kind anyone could buy in any store in Geneva, because she wanted her signature to have nothing ceremonial about it. She wrote her name simply and clearly, set the pen down, and looked at what she had just signed. She didn't feel triumph. She felt tired in that particular way people feel after something very big and very difficult has ended. A tiredness that is also a kind of peace. She thought about all the people who had made this moment possible, those in this room and those who weren't, those who had returned from the battle at Mars and the asteroid belt, and those who hadn't. She thought about the wing of destroyers. She thought about them for a long time in the middle of the crowded historical room, and she was very quiet. Then she stood and shook the hand of the Imperial representative across the table, and the room moved on, and the work continued. Yara Yarashin was back on the ISS Unbroken when the message came. She was at her desk, doing the mundane administrative work that ship commanders spend a surprising amount of time on, when a priority signal pinged on her console. She looked at the header, ML Deep Recon, one of the deep-range ships operating in unmapped regions of the galaxy beyond the areas that even the Empire had mapped. Humanity had sent scouts into that darkness long ago, quietly and without announcement, because they were the type of species that couldn't look at an unexplored place without wanting to know what was there. She opened the message. It was short. Deep-range scout commanders didn't write long messages. The transmission cost was too high and the distance too great. They said only what needed to be said, and nothing more. Command, you need to see this. We have discovered structures in this region. Ancient, large, unlike anything in any known database. Age estimates place construction at a minimum of 40,000 years ago. Currently, no life is detected, but the structures are undamaged, and there are energy readings that we cannot explain. There is something else. We have picked up long-range observation signals originating from beyond the known galaxy. We cannot determine the source. We cannot determine how long they have been observing. We believe they were observing the battle, all waiting for orders. Yara read the message twice. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her cabin for a long time. 40,000 years. Structures standing in the dark, something patient and ancient and observant, sitting on the edge of everything known, watching a small species on a small world in an unremarkable star system that had just done something that obviously had been worth observing. Humanity was young, the galaxy was old. Whatever was out there was even older. And somehow, unimaginably, wonderfully, they were only just beginning. The ISS Unbroken held its position in the solar system. Its running lights burned steadily against the black, and its crew went about their work in the warm, lively interior of the ship. Around it, the lights of thousands of other ships, human and Velhari, Sandre and Cray, burned in the darkness like a small city that had appeared out of nowhere and intended to stay. The stars didn't answer, they never did, but they were there, all of them, in all directions, as far as anything could see and further, waiting. And humanity, as it always had been, was already heading toward its own.